I always find peace in the garden in the morning.
It's beautiful, Mr. Hayes, just like in my book.
I'm happy to help, Miss Alice. Thank you so much, dear. You have such a kind heart.
Thank you all. I stand here committed to the vision we share. Her leadership honors his legacy.
The people who treat you like you are invisible are often the least prepared for the day everyone finally sees your worth. Emily Carter had heard words like that before, but she never imagined they would have anything to do with her life. At 24 years old, she lived and worked inside the Whitmore estate, a sprawling mansion just outside Boston that sat on nearly 20 acres of perfectly maintained land. To anyone driving past the iron gates, it looked like a place where dreams came true. To Emily, it was simply where she woke up before sunrise and went to sleep long after everyone else had finished their day. Every morning began the same way. She prepared coffee before the household staff arrived, organized breakfast trays, checked schedules, answered requests, and handled dozens of small tasks that seemed invisible until they were not done. Nobody ever thanked her. Nobody ever asked if she was tired. Most days, the members of the Whitmore family barely looked at her when they spoke. Victoria Whitmore, the wife of Charles Whitmore's oldest son, treated Emily as though she were part of the furniture. Emily, the dining room needs attention. Emily, where are the guest towels? Emily, why are you standing there? The commands never stopped. Emily always answered politely. She always smiled. She always did what was asked. Jason Whitmore, Victoria's son, was no better. At 28, he carried himself like a future king waiting for his crown. Whenever guests visited the mansion, he spoke about investments, luxury cars, and the fortune he expected to inherit one day. Sometimes he joked about Emily right in front of her. If loyalty earned stock shares, she would own the company by now, he once laughed. The room joined him. Emily simply lowered her eyes and continued clearing plates. Olivia Whitmore, Jason's younger sister, rarely spoke directly to Emily unless she needed something. To her, Emily was just another employee, another person whose name was remembered only when convenient. Yet despite everything, Emily never responded with anger. She understood something most people in that house did not. Character revealed itself when nobody was watching. Her parents had taught her that before they passed away years earlier. Since then, those lessons were all she had left. So she treated everyone kindly. She greeted the gardeners. She helped the kitchen staff finish early whenever possible. She carried groceries for elderly workers and remembered birthdays nobody else cared about. Small things. Simple things. Things that never seemed important to the people living inside the mansion. One rainy evening, after a long day of preparing for an upcoming family gathering, Emily stood alone in the grand hallway collecting abandoned glasses and folded napkins. Voices drifted from the nearby sitting room. She recognized Victoria immediately. Honestly, I do not know why Charles keeps her around, Victoria said. She acts like she belongs here. A few people chuckled. Jason's voice followed. She should be grateful she even has a room upstairs. More laughter filled the room. Emily paused for only a second before continuing her work. Her expression never changed. But deep inside, the words settled heavily. Not because they were new, but because they confirmed what she had always known. No matter how much she gave, she would never be one of them. What Emily did not know was that someone else had heard every word spoken that night. From the shadows of a nearby corridor, 80-year-old Charles Whitmore stood silently with his hand resting on a polished oak cane. The founder of the Whitmore fortune watched the hallway as Emily quietly carried the tray away without complaint. His eyes followed her until she disappeared around the corner. Then he looked toward the room where his family continued laughing. For a long moment he said nothing at all. But behind the calm expression of the billionaire patriarch, something had begun to change. The following morning arrived gray and quiet, with a steady drizzle tapping against the tall windows of the Whitmore estate. Emily began her day before 6 o'clock, moving through the mansion with the same calm efficiency she carried every morning. She expected nothing unusual. She certainly did not expect Charles Whitmore to call her name. It happened shortly after breakfast. Emily was organizing fresh flowers in the main hallway when she heard a voice behind her. "Miss Carter." She turned immediately. Charles stood a few feet away, leaning lightly on his cane. Even after all the years she had worked at the estate, direct conversations with him were rare. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," she said politely. Charles studied her for a moment. "Would you walk with me?" Emily glanced around, uncertain she had heard correctly. Of course. Together they moved through a quiet corridor toward the oldest section of the mansion. Very few people entered that wing. Most family members preferred the newer spaces with their modern finishes and expensive furnishings. Charles led her to a large wooden door at the end of the hallway. When he unlocked it, Emily found herself staring into an enormous private library. Floor-to-ceiling shelves stretched across the room. Thousands of books lined the walls. Sunlight filtered through tall windows despite the rain outside. The room felt less like part of a mansion and more like a world hidden from everyone else. "I have not spent enough time here lately," Charles said. "Age has a way of changing priorities." Emily smiled politely. "It is beautiful." Charles nodded. "Most people who enter this room only notice how valuable the books are." He looked at her. "You noticed the room itself." Emily was unsure how to respond. Charles slowly walked toward a shelf and removed an old volume. "Tell me something, Miss Carter. If you could have anything in life, what would it be?" The question caught her off guard. She thought for several seconds. "Peace," she finally answered. Charles raised an eyebrow. "Not money." "Money helps," Emily admitted. "But I have seen people with money who were not happy." Charles remained silent. "Peace lasts longer," she added. Something almost resembling amusement crossed his face. For the next half hour, Charles continued asking questions. They were simple questions, yet unlike any Emily had ever heard from the family. What had she wanted to become as a child? What books did she enjoy? What made her proud? What disappointed her? No one in the Whitmore family had ever shown interest in her thoughts before. When their conversation ended, Charles thanked her and returned to his study. Emily went back to work confused but grateful. She assumed the conversation meant little. What she did not know was that Charles had spent years watching people reveal themselves whenever they believed something valuable was within reach. Wealth had taught him many lessons. One of the most important was that character often appeared when there was nothing to gain. Over the following days, Charles continued observing. He watched Emily help an elderly groundskeeper repair a damaged garden fence during her lunch break. He noticed her spending her own money to replace a broken birthday cake for a kitchen assistant whose celebration had been forgotten. He saw her quietly leave encouraging notes for employees struggling through difficult weeks. None of those actions earned her recognition. None improved her position. Nobody important even noticed them. Nobody except Charles. And with each passing day, the questions forming in his mind became harder to ignore. Over the next several weeks, a quiet pattern began to emerge inside the Whitmore estate, though almost nobody noticed it. Emily continued living exactly as she always had. She woke before dawn, completed her responsibilities, and treated every person she encountered with the same kindness. Whether they were executives visiting the mansion or maintenance workers repairing a broken light fixture. To Emily, people were people. Status never impressed her. One Thursday afternoon, a delivery driver arrived during a heavy rainstorm carrying several large boxes for an upcoming family event. The driver was older, perhaps in his late 60s, and struggled to move the packages across the wet stone pathway leading to the service entrance. Several members of the household staff were busy preparing for guests. Without hesitation, Emily grabbed an umbrella, walked outside, and spent nearly 40 minutes helping the man unload every box. By the time they finished, her sleeves were damp and her shoes were covered in mud. The driver thanked her repeatedly. Emily simply smiled and wished him a safe drive home. From a second-floor window, Charles watched the entire exchange. The following week brought another small moment. One of the kitchen assistants, Maria, received a phone call during work and learned that her grandson had been admitted to the hospital for observation after becoming seriously ill. Maria was shaken and preparing to leave when she realized she could not finish her responsibilities before dinner service. Emily quietly stepped in. She worked late into the evening helping the kitchen staff complete every remaining task. She never mentioned it to anyone afterward. Maria returned the next day expecting complaints about unfinished work. Instead, everything had been handled. Again, Charles noticed. What fascinated him was not that Emily occasionally performed generous acts. Many people did that when others were watching. What fascinated him was that she behaved the same way when nobody seemed to care. There was no audience. No reward. No recognition. Just a consistent pattern of character. Meanwhile, the rest of the Whitmore family became increasingly focused on Charles and his future estate. Jason spent more time discussing company valuations and investment portfolios than actual people. Olivia frequently asked questions about family trusts and inheritance structures. Victoria organized expensive dinners whenever influential guests visited, making certain everyone noticed her efforts. Charles listened carefully. The more he observed, the clearer the contrast became. One evening, Emily entered the library carrying a stack of books Charles had requested. She placed them carefully on a side table. As she prepared to leave, Charles stopped her. "Miss Carter, may I ask you another question?" "Of course, Mr. Whitmore." Charles leaned back in his chair. "If someone gave you more money than you could ever spend, what would you do with it?" Emily laughed softly. "That is a very unlikely problem. Pretend it happened." She thought for several seconds. "I would make sure the people I care about were secure. Then I would help people who never get opportunities." Charles studied her expression. There was no excitement in her answer. No fantasy about luxury homes, private jets, or expensive vacations. She sounded sincere. "Why?" he asked. Emily looked down briefly before answering. "Because I know what it feels like when nobody believes you matter." Silence settled over the library. For the first time in many years, Charles Whitmore felt something he rarely experienced. Certainty. And although Emily had no way of knowing it, that simple conversation would soon become far more important than either of them imagined. As summer approached, preparations began for Charles Whitmore's 80th birthday celebration, an event that the Whitmore family treated less like a family gathering and more like a public display of wealth and influence. Invitations were sent to business leaders, politicians, philanthropists, and longtime associates from across the country. Every room of the estate became part of a carefully planned presentation. Victoria took complete control of the event. She issued instructions from morning until night, directing staff members, reviewing decorations, approving menus, and making certain every detail reflected the prestige of the Whitmore name. Emily found herself carrying a heavier workload than ever before. She coordinated deliveries, managed schedules, assisted vendors, and solved countless last-minute problems that appeared each day. Yet despite doing much of the work that kept preparations moving smoothly, she remained invisible in the eyes of the family. One afternoon, a floral designer arrived with arrangements worth thousands of dollars. After reviewing the display, Victoria frowned and pointed toward the ballroom entrance. "Those centerpieces need to be moved immediately." Emily nodded and began organizing the adjustments. Before she could finish, Victoria spoke loudly enough for several guests and staff members to hear. "Honestly, if I had known how much supervision was required, I would have hired someone more experienced." The comment drew a few uncomfortable smiles from people standing nearby. Emily quietly continued working. She had learned long ago that defending herself only created more problems. Across the room, Charles observed the exchange without saying a word. Later that evening, another incident occurred. Jason was giving several friends a tour of the estate before the party. As they walked through the grand hallway, one of the visitors asked who Emily was. Jason laughed. "She practically lives here. If the mansion had a mascot, it would be her." His friends chuckled. Emily happened to be arranging place settings nearby. Jason never even looked in her direction. To him, the remark seemed harmless. to Charles, it revealed far more than Jason intended. The closer the celebration came, the more obvious the family's priorities became. Conversations constantly drifted toward company leadership, trust structures, future ownership, and financial expectations. Everyone spoke as though Charles's fortune had already been divided. Everyone seemed eager to discuss what would happen after he was gone. Very few people asked what he actually wanted. One evening, 2 days before the birthday gala, Emily was carrying documents to Charles's study when she noticed the library door partially open. Inside, several members of the family were meeting with Charles. Their voices carried into the hallway. Victoria was speaking. "You have spent your entire life building this legacy. The family deserves clarity about the future." Jason quickly added, "Investors need confidence too." Charles remained silent for several moments before answering. "Interesting." The room grew quiet. "Whenever someone speaks to me about the future these days," he continued, "the conversation always seems to involve my money." No one responded immediately. Emily quietly walked away before hearing anything more. She never intended to listen, yet those words stayed with her. Later that night, while most of the estate slept, Charles sat alone in his library reviewing several folders spread across his desk. Beside them rested a sealed envelope bearing his signature. After a long moment, he placed his hand on the envelope and looked toward the dark window. The decision forming in his mind was no longer a possibility. It was becoming a certainty. The birthday celebration exceeded every expectation. Hundreds of guests filled the Whitmore estate. Luxury vehicles lined the circular driveway. Elegant music drifted through the gardens. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the ballroom, while servers carried trays of carefully prepared meals through crowds of influential visitors. To the outside world, it appeared to be a perfect evening honoring one of the most respected business leaders in America. Behind the scenes, however, Charles spent much of the night observing rather than celebrating. He watched family members move from guest to guest, discussing investments, opportunities, and social connections. He listened as people praised his accomplishments. Yet the praise often sounded rehearsed, as though many were speaking to his wealth rather than to the man himself. Emily spent the evening working almost non-stop. She coordinated vendors, solved scheduling conflicts, and quietly handled problems before they became visible to guests. When a catering delay threatened dinner service, she found a solution. When an important guest misplaced personal belongings, she located them within minutes. When a server became ill, she stepped in to assist without complaint. Most attendees never noticed her efforts. That was exactly how she preferred it. Near the end of the evening, Charles asked Emily to bring him a cup of tea in the library. Once the door closed behind them, the noise of the celebration faded. For a few moments, neither spoke. Charles looked tired, not physically exhausted, but thoughtful. "You have worked very hard tonight," he said. "Everyone has, Mr. Whitmore." Charles smiled faintly. "That is not what I asked." Emily lowered her eyes. "Thank you." Charles studied her carefully. "Do you know what disappoints me most about success?" Emily shook her head. "Success attracts many people. Very few stay for the right reasons." The words lingered in the quiet room. Before Emily could respond, a knock interrupted them. Charles's attorney, Richard Lawson, entered carrying a leather briefcase. Emily immediately excused herself and returned to her responsibilities. As the library door closed, she caught a brief glimpse of several folders spread across Charles's desk. She thought nothing of it and continued with her evening. Inside the library, however, a very different conversation was taking place. Richard sat across from Charles and opened the briefcase. "Are you certain?" he asked quietly. Charles nodded. "More certain than I have been about anything in years." Richard removed several documents. "Once finalized, there will be no misunderstanding regarding your intentions." Charles glanced toward the closed door. "That is exactly what I want." Over the next hour, they reviewed documents, signed paperwork, and discussed specific instructions. Among the papers was the sealed envelope Charles had been protecting for weeks. Richard placed it carefully with the others. Would you like me to store this with the rest? Charles looked at the envelope for a long moment. Yes, it must be read exactly when the time comes. Richard agreed. Before leaving, he asked one final question. Do you expect resistance? Charles laughed softly. I expect outrage. Meanwhile, the celebration continued downstairs. Jason spoke confidently about future business plans. Victoria entertained guests as though she already held authority over the family legacy. Olivia discussed charitable foundations she hoped to oversee someday. None of them realized that while they were imagining their futures, the future itself had already begun to move beyond their control. And hidden inside a sealed envelope resting in Richard Lawson's possession was a truth capable of changing every life connected to the Whitmore name. The weeks following the birthday celebration brought a noticeable change to the atmosphere inside the Whitmore estate. Summer gradually gave way to early autumn, and for the first time, Charles Whitmore began stepping back from many of the responsibilities that had defined his life for decades. Board meetings were shortened. Public appearances became less frequent. Several executives were instructed to communicate through assistants rather than directly through him. Officially, nothing was wrong. Unofficially, everyone could see that age was beginning to demand its due. The family reacted in very different ways. Victoria became increasingly interested in discussions involving succession plans and corporate leadership. Jason spent more time visiting company offices, eager to present himself as the natural future of the Whitmore legacy. Olivia began networking with charitable organizations, quietly positioning herself for influence within the family foundation. Each of them seemed determined to secure a place in the future they assumed awaited them. Emily, however, paid little attention to any of it. Her focus remained exactly where it had always been. She made sure daily operations ran smoothly. She helped staff members solve problems. She assisted Charles whenever he requested support. Unlike everyone else, she never treated his changing health as an opportunity. She treated it as a reason to be more considerate. One afternoon, Charles canceled a scheduled meeting after feeling unusually fatigued. Most family members were disappointed because important business guests had traveled to attend. Emily simply brought lunch to the library and encouraged him to rest. When she returned several hours later, she found him sitting quietly beside the window overlooking the gardens. You should be enjoying the afternoon, Charles said. Emily smiled. I can enjoy it later. Charles looked outside. People spend their entire lives chasing success. Then one day they realized time was the more valuable asset. Emily pulled a chair closer. You built something remarkable. Charles shook his head gently. Buildings, companies, investments. Those are not the things people remember in the end. His gaze shifted toward her. Character lasts longer. The conversation remained with Emily long after she left the room. Meanwhile, tensions within the family continued to grow. Several disagreements emerged regarding future responsibilities inside the company. Jason openly disagreed with Olivia during a family dinner. Victoria criticized decisions she believed should already be under her influence. What had once been private ambitions slowly became visible rivalries. Charles noticed every moment. More importantly, he noticed who stayed out of those conversations entirely. One rainy evening, the estate experienced a temporary power outage caused by severe weather. Backup systems activated quickly, but several staff members were stranded in different areas of the property. Without being asked, Emily spent hours helping coordinate everyone, ensuring elderly employees reached their homes safely and checking that emergency systems were functioning properly. By the time power returned, it was nearly midnight. Exhausted, she finally prepared to retire for the evening. As she passed the library, she noticed light beneath the door. Inside, Charles sat with Richard Lawson once again. Documents covered the desk. Neither man noticed her. Before she quietly walked away, she heard Richard ask a single question. Are you absolutely certain this is the legacy you wish to leave behind? Charles answered without hesitation. More certain than ever. Emily continued down the hallway, unaware that the future of the Whitmore family had already been decided, and that events were moving toward a moment none of them would soon forget. Less than 3 months later, The day everyone feared finally arrived. Charles Whitmore passed away peacefully at the age of 80. The news spread quickly through business circles, charitable organizations, and media outlets across the country. Tributes poured in from former employees, community leaders, and longtime friends. Newspapers celebrated his accomplishments. Television networks discussed the empire he had built. Yet inside the Whitmore estate, grief was mixed with something far less noble. Questions about the future began almost immediately. The funeral was held on a cool autumn morning beneath a gray sky. Hundreds of people attended. Executives stood beside gardeners. Former assistants sat near business partners. People from every chapter of Charles's life came to pay their respects. Emily remained in the background throughout the service, helping coordinate guests and ensuring everything proceeded smoothly. She never sought attention. In fact, she felt strangely out of place among so many important people. Despite that feeling, she could not ignore the sadness she carried. Charles had been one of the few people who ever treated her as though her thoughts mattered. During the reception following the service, conversations quietly shifted away from memories and toward speculation. Guests wondered who would lead Whitmore Holdings. Reporters discussed possible successors. Investors exchanged theories about future ownership. Inside a private sitting room, Victoria, Jason, and Olivia held their own discussion. Jason appeared especially confident. "The company needs stability," he said. "Everyone already expects me to take a larger role." Victoria nodded. "Your grandfather understood the importance of keeping leadership within the family." Olivia said little, though she clearly expected to receive a significant portion of the estate herself. None of them seemed concerned. They spoke as though outcomes had already been decided. Emily accidentally overheard part of the conversation while delivering documents requested by household staff. Before she could leave, Victoria noticed her standing near the doorway. "You can put those there," Victoria said coldly. Then she added, "And there is no reason for you to attend tomorrow's meeting." Emily looked confused. "What meeting?" Jason smiled. "The attorney is gathering family members for the estate reading." He emphasized the word family. The message was unmistakable. Emily quietly placed the documents on a nearby table and left the room without responding. That evening she packed a small suitcase. Not because anyone had asked her to leave, but because she assumed her time at the estate was ending. Charles had been the reason she stayed. Without him, there seemed little reason to remain. The next morning arrived with an unexpected surprise. Shortly after breakfast, Richard Lawson appeared at her door. "Miss Carter," he said, "I need you to accompany me to the library at 2 o'clock this afternoon." Emily blinked. "There must be some mistake." Richard shook his head. "There is no mistake. But I am not family." Richard's expression remained calm. "Mr. Whitmore specifically requested your presence." Hours later, the library filled with members of the Whitmore family, senior advisors, and several legal representatives. Tension hung in the air. Everyone understood the importance of the moment. Emily sat quietly near the back of the room, wishing she were somewhere else. Richard Lawson waited until the clock struck 2 before opening a large folder resting on the table. He looked around the room and spoke carefully. "Today we are gathered to review the final wishes of Charles Whitmore." No one realized that within the next few minutes, every assumption they carried about the future was about to be shattered. The library remained silent as Richard Lawson adjusted his glasses and opened the folder containing Charles Whitmore's final instructions. Every face in the room reflected expectation. Jason sat forward in his chair with confidence. Victoria maintained a composed expression, though her eyes revealed anticipation. Olivia folded her hands neatly in her lap. Emily remained near the back of the room, uncomfortable even being present. Richard began with several charitable donations and personal gifts. Specific amounts were allocated to foundations, longtime employees, and community organizations that Charles had supported throughout his life. The family listened patiently. They knew those items were only formalities. Everyone was waiting for the same moment. Finally, Richard turned to the final section. The remainder of the Whitmore estate, including controlling ownership of Whitmore Holdings, all associated investment accounts, real estate holdings, and personal assets, shall be transferred to a single beneficiary. The room seemed to stop breathing. Jason exchanged a confident glance with Victoria. Richard continued reading. The sole beneficiary designated by Charles Whitmore is Emily Carter. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Emily herself appeared unable to process what she had just heard. Her eyes widened. "There must be some mistake," she whispered. Jason was the first to stand. "That is impossible." Victoria's face lost all color. "Read that again." Richard remained calm. "The language is clear and legally binding." Olivia stared at Emily as though she were looking at a stranger. Why would he do that? The question hung in the air. Richard slowly reached for another document. Mr. Whitmore anticipated this reaction. He removed a sealed envelope. Several people immediately recognized it. It was the same envelope Charles had protected during the final months of his life. Richard carefully broke the seal. "Mr. Whitmore instructed me to read this letter immediately following the announcement of his will." The room fell silent once more. Richard began reading. "If you are hearing these words, then my family is likely asking the same question. Why Emily? The answer is simple. Because character matters. Over the last several years, I watched many people compete for what they believed would someday belong to them. I watched conversations revolve around money, influence, and entitlement. I listened carefully. I observed even more carefully. During that same time, I also watched a young woman who expected nothing. She showed kindness when nobody was watching. She treated employees with dignity. She offered help without seeking recognition. She respected people regardless of their position. Most importantly, she remained the same person whether she was speaking to a billionaire or a groundskeeper. That quality cannot be purchased, inherited, or taught through privilege." Richard paused briefly before continuing. "To my family, this decision is not a punishment. It is a lesson. Wealth is not a reward for being related to someone successful. Wealth is a responsibility." Emily demonstrated she understands that responsibility long before she ever possessed it. By the time the letter ended, nobody had an argument left to make. They might not have agreed with Charles's decision, but they could no longer claim not to understand it. Emily sat motionless, overwhelmed by emotions she could barely describe. She had entered the room believing she would soon leave the estate forever. Instead, she had just inherited a future she never sought and a responsibility greater than anything she had ever imagined. The months that followed transformed the Whitmore estate in ways nobody could have predicted. News of Charles Whitmore's decision spread quickly through business circles, generating endless speculation. Some people believed Emily would sell everything and disappear. Others assumed she would be overwhelmed by the responsibility. A few expected her to seek revenge against those who had treated her poorly. They were all wrong. Emily spent her first weeks meeting with company leaders, financial advisors, and employees at every level of Whitmore Holdings. Rather than arriving with grand promises, she listened. She asked questions. She visited offices, warehouses, and community programs supported by the company. She wanted to understand the legacy Charles had trusted her to protect. What surprised many people was how quickly employees responded to her leadership. Unlike previous executives, Emily remembered names. She listened to concerns. She thanked people for their work. For the first time in years, many employees felt seen. The changes she introduced were practical rather than dramatic. Employee assistance programs expanded. Educational scholarships were increased. Long overdue improvements were approved for facilities that had been ignored for years. Charles had spent a lifetime building success. Emily focused on ensuring that success benefited the people who helped create it. Back at the estate, the atmosphere gradually changed as well. Several longtime staff members who had once feared losing their jobs found unexpected security. Emily guaranteed that every employee would be treated fairly and respectfully. The people who had quietly supported one another behind the scenes suddenly found themselves working in an environment built on the very values they had always hoped for. As for the Whitmore family, Adjusting to reality proved difficult. Jason struggled the most. For months he remained angry, convinced the outcome had been unfair. Yet over time, even he began to recognize that Charles had not acted impulsively. Every decision had been deliberate. Olivia eventually reached out to Emily. Their first conversations were awkward, but gradually they became more honest. For the first time, Olivia asked questions instead of making assumptions. Victoria remained distant longer than anyone else. Pride can be difficult to surrender, but even she could not ignore the results unfolding around her. One spring afternoon, nearly a year after Charles's passing, Emily returned to the library where so many important conversations had taken place. The room looked exactly as it always had. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows. Thousands of books lined the shelves. On a nearby table rested a framed photograph of Charles. Emily sat quietly in the chair he once occupied and reflected on how dramatically life had changed. She had inherited enormous wealth, but that was not the gift Charles truly left behind. The greater inheritance was his belief in her. He had seen value in her when nobody else bothered to look. He had trusted character over entitlement. He had chosen integrity over expectation. Looking around the library, Emily finally understood the lesson he wanted everyone to learn. A legacy is not measured by the amount of money someone leaves behind. It is measured by the lives they influence and the values they choose to pass forward. Charles Whitmore built an empire, but his greatest achievement was proving that true worth has nothing to do with status, privilege, or family name. And in the end, the woman they once treated as invisible became the person who carried his legacy into the future.
Before this story ends, remember about Emily Carter's story. She never chased recognition or changed herself to impress the others. While people around her pursue wealth and status, she quietly built something more valuable. It is her character. Money and success can come and go, but kindness, integrity, and humility is the choice that you make every day. If you've ever been overlooked or underestimated, remember, your worth is defining your value, not the other's opinion. Sometimes life's greatest reward comes quietly, arriving only after years of patience, resilience, and doing the right thing that no one's watching. Remember, your greatest legacy will never be your wealth, but the way you treat the others every day. The kindness you show today may become the reason that someone will believe in people tomorrow. If you like this video, remember to like, share, and subscribe, and leave a comment below. Thanks for watching.